Hello, I'm Elaine LaChapelle, Head of Membership and Leadership Development here at the Ontario Real Estate Association. And I have the pleasure of speaking today with Rahul Bhardwaj. Rahul is President and CEO of the Institute of Corporate Directors, which is a Canadian not-for-profit association with more than 15,000 members. Rahul recently participated in our panel on evolving governance that we held at the AREA Peak Leadership Summit. And I've asked him to join us today and share some of the insights that he shared at that panel. Welcome, Rahul.
Great to be here today.
Great, thanks for joining us. We talked about some very interesting things on the panel and sort of from the past and the future, but because boards of directors have had to adjust how they govern during this pandemic, I wanted to ask you to focus on looking ahead at some ways you think that this is going to impact how they govern after the pandemic is behind us. So the first question I have for you is, what are some of the changes that have happened as a result of COVID-19 that you feel boards will continue to maintain after the pandemic is passed?
It's a great question because everybody's looking ahead, and it's such an important place to start for boards to really have that conversation with themselves. So I'd say during COVID, early days, it was liquidity. How do you keep the organization going? Now they're starting to look more at continuity for all the reasons you can imagine. Whether there's supply chain issues, human capital issues, depending on your industry, inflation. How about your response to climate change? What about all the social pressures that are coming onto boards as well? So this is all under uncertainty, which was certainly there before, but now it's in a new context. And when you really drill down, I think most boards are going to be looking at that to say, our duty is to do what's in the best interest of the corporation. And we do that by having oversight of culture, strategy, and risk. So they'd be wise to really focus on how is culture, strategy, and risk really changed through COVID, and where do they want to put their emphasis?
Wow, I mean, it's a tall task, a tall order for any board of directors. And do you think that they will be maintaining some of the different methods of meeting that they did before, remote meetings, changing the way they might be voting?
I think all of those are to be decided. So I know that some boards, when they went into COVID, there was, well, we'll do this for 3 months or 6 months and stay online, but clearly that can't be the best way to do it. 6 months in, you saw directors coming back saying, gee, this is really efficient. This accessibility piece really works. So now it's how do we strike the right balance where we can have very efficient, potentially online meetings, but maybe we should have a retreat where we meet once a year because that interpersonal part is so important as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we've all found things we love about it and things we're not so fond of. Have there been any impacts on governance, board governance, that you feel are concerning at all?
Well, corporate governance is so contextual. So if you're in the digital world, or whether you're in extractive resources or financial services, or if you're in a not-for-profit or an association, the context for what you're doing your work is very, very different. The type of uncertainties you're dealing with, very different. Your capital base is very different. Your employee base, all of these things are really different. So it's tough to say there's one thing that everybody needs to be looking at, but there is, or I should say there are a few themes that I think are common. Clearly, there's digital uncertainty that all boards are grappling with. What sort of disruptions are going on in their industry? You can't get away from that. Coming out of COVID, an extremely important part of culture is the human capital part, your workforce. What's the new expectation from work for home? What are the implications for oversight of culture? And for management and productivity and all of those, it's going to be a very new world as it relates to employees. And of course, then there are the social pressures. There's a very different perspective on the role of a corporation today than there was 10 years ago. Now, we don't know where it's going to be in 5 years. Things could bounce back a little bit. But right now, there's a very different level of introspection going on in terms of boards, and really focused on how do they serve multiple stakeholders.
That's interesting because even the remote nature of some board meetings may allow or encourage different people to join boards of directors, maybe increasing diversity a bit or regional representation. Do you think some of those things will change as well?
Absolutely, and I can see it happening already. It's, the accessibility is just so much more present now. To your point, the cost and the barrier to entry to a board is so much less if you can do it online. If you can do it online, 3 of the meetings a year, meet once a year, it frees up time on director schedules. It can be coordinated quite simply, and obviously keeps the costs down as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, some strong benefits. Where do you think boards should go from here? Where do you think they'll be heading? What kind of new things do you think they'll be getting into?
Well, it's all about the uncertainty and the change. And someone along the journey the last couple of years said to me, if you think things are fast, just remember this is the slowest they'll ever be. So the sense that there's going to be an acceleration of change and uncertainty, I think, is really going to force the boards to look very carefully at their agendas. First of all, to make sure, are we focused on the right things? Are we getting the right information? And at the end of the day, that's leading towards the question of, do we have the right strategy for the organization to succeed? And if you can answer all of those questions, one of the corollaries is going to be, well, if this is the right strategy, do we have the right people around the table? Which means there's going to be a moment of introspection where boards are going to look at their own construction and the construction of their management team. So it's this constant cycle of evaluation that's going to take place in an environment of uncertainty. We know that. Disruption quite potentially, but it's all going to be accelerated as well.
You had mentioned when we were having the panel about how important it is that boards look at all stakeholders and how they serve all stakeholders. Do you want to just elaborate that on a little bit? I thought you made some very good points.
So this is still a hot topic of debate. There's some more orthodox corporate governance perspectives in certain industries. They'll say, no, this is really crystal clear. You focus on enhancing shareholder value, end of story. And that's one that's been, quite strong in the States, predominant, but even that's been moving into more stakeholder. In other words, the best interest of the corporation is actually looking out for all stakeholders and balancing their interests. Now, we know that when you come to Canada, that's built right into our CBCA. So this is right into our common law and our legislation. But the devil's in the detail. When do you do it? How do you do it? What's the impact of it? How does it impact performance? And these are all questions that are very much being debated right now. But it's clear that shareholders in the corporate environment have very specific legal rights that have to be looked at, the boards need to be attendant to. But we know that there's an expectation of corporations that they take a wider perspective on who their stakeholders are. Their employees, what's the impact of decisions on them? What is the impact on the communities they serve? And we know in a time of truth and reconciliation in Canada, Indigenous issues around, for instance, extractive industries and forestry, it's a very big issue. So for boards might have perspectives on them, but what you can't avoid is engaging your stakeholders.
I'm going to leave it on that point. I think that's a really good one as we look more broadly at the impact of our organizations on others. I think that's a great place to leave it. Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing some of your thoughts with us today. I've been speaking with Rahul Bhardwaj, President and CEO of the Institute of Corporate Directors. Thanks, Rahul.
My pleasure.